You can see here I've got some peptide spectra and I've managed to assign one arginine. However, I've not had to use all of the peaks in the spectra in order to make that assignment. So if I, for instance, drag this NMR residue over, so that's marking all the chemical shifts within that arginine, you can see, particularly here in this toxy spectrum, there are lots of peaks which I haven't labelled, but which obviously belong to that arginine, and the same here in my carbon HSQC toxy. Now obviously it would be useful if I were to pick and label all of those peaks, because then I know what those peaks belong to and they won't get in the way as I'm trying to make my other assignments. However, doing all of that by hand is a little bit tedious, so we've got a macro for you to be able to do that. In order to run the macro, you need to make sure that all your experiment types have been set. So if you go to Spectrum and then Set Experiment Types, or you can use the shortcut ET, then you'll see a list of all your spectra and you can set the experiment type for that spectrum. Not all experiment types are currently supported, so the HMBC, for instance, isn't, and obviously not nosy spectra, because there you might have through space transfers and we can't account for those. To run the macro, go to Macro and then Run CCPN Macros and then select PeaksFromNmrResidues. You get a little pop-up and you can make various selections. So we obviously want to work with this arginine NMR residue, and you just need to check that the correct chemical shift list has been selected as well. Now we can select in which spectra we want to create peaks, so I'm just going to go for this toxy spectrum and also the carbon HSQC toxy. So I just need to drag them into the included box. Next we can select which peak lists to use. So I've just got one peak list per spectrum, so I'm just going to use those, but obviously I could create new ones if I wanted. Then comes the peak creation method. So either the peaks can just literally be placed at the ppm positions that are indicated here, or I could do a small area peak pick around this position. So it depends a little bit on your spectra, how crowded they are, how much overlap there is, as to whether you want to place the peaks or pick the peaks. In this instance, I'm just going to place them. You can select whether or not to confine yourself to aliphatic peaks only, and it's always worth checking for existing peaks, because obviously I do have a few peaks here that are already that have already been picked and labelled, and so I don't really want to place another peak on top of those. This lower section is not needed at the moment. We'll come back to that later. So now I can create my peaks, and you can see here everywhere where there is an intersection of these marks, a peak has been created. Now an alternative use for this macro is as I start to do my assignments for the next residues. So for instance, I know that this protein contains a proline. I've already imported some reference chemical shifts, and we've got another video that shows you how you can do that. So I'm just going to find the proline and drag that in here, and you can see it's going to mark all the average chemical shifts that you typically see for a proline residue. Now obviously those don't exactly overlay with any peaks in my spectrum, but it's fairly easy to spot where the proline is. So you can see here these peaks and these ones over here, and the same in the HSQC. So these are just moved up slightly, this one is moved slightly over to the right. So what I now might want to do is, rather than again going through all of these by hand and creating them and assigning them, creating the NMR atoms for them, I can use our macro to help me and do a little bit of a shortcut. So I'm going to go to again to Macro, Run CCPN Macros and pick peaks from NMR residues. So I'm now going to select here my reference chemical shift proline. It's automatically also selected the chemical shift list that goes along with that, and I want to pick peaks initially just in my carbon HSQC toxy. I'm going to go for the same options as before, and now I'm also going to say I want to assign the peaks to new NMR residue, because I don't want them to be labelled as reference chemical shift 15 proline. I want them to be in my A chain, and I want them to be residue 3. So having selected those, I can create my peaks. Now obviously these peaks are not quite in the right place because they've been put at the average chemical shift position, but it's very easy to move them. So I can just select this whole strip, for instance, and then with the middle mouse button I can move them over to where they really should be. And then in the same way I can select this strip across here and move them up. And then you can continue the same process. And then at the end you can select them all and simply do SE to snap them to the extremum, and then you've got all your peaks in place. And with that residue assigned, you can now use the macro again to find all your peaks in the other spectra.